He that shall live this day and see old age will yearly on the vigil feast his neighbours, and say, "Tomorrow is St. Crispian." Then will he strip his sleeve and show his scars, and say, "These wounds I had on Crispin's day." Old men forget, yet all shall be forgot, but he'll remember with advantages what feats he did that day. Then shall our names, familiar in his mouth as household words, be in their flowing cups freshly remembered. This story shall the good man teach his son, and Crispian shall ne'er go by, from this day to the ending of the world. But we in it shall be remembered, we few, we happy few, we band of brothers. For he today that sheds his blood with me shall be my brother, be he ne'er so vile. This day shall gentle his condition, and gentlemen in England, now abed, shall think themselves accursed they were not here, and hold their manhoods cheap whilst any speaks that fought with us upon St. Crispin's day. Hurricane and Spitfire Pilots at War by Terence. Chapter 1. The Few. Shakespeare's lines from Henry V, perhaps the finest poetry of its kind ever penned, refer of course to Agincourt, which in the annals of British history stands out as one of the most brilliant, heroic and vital battles which were fought and won. Other battles, which, however different in their nature, deserve to be spoken of in equal context, are Waterloo and Trafalgar. Had any of these three been lost, then the whole course of British history would have been quite changed. We can be proud that one more battle may justifiably be added to the list, the Battle of Britain. Had Shakespeare been alive today, he would surely have been moved to write a play with pilots amongst his actors, and a leading role played by Sir Winston Churchill, for whom he would no doubt have composed a soliloquy as stirring as King Henry's. And one is tempted to think something not so dissimilar to this thought may have passed through Churchill's mind when he borrowed from King Henry's speech and dubbed these men the Few. Such are the awful possibilities of modern war, so complex in its ingredients, so huge its possible scale, that it may well be that no future writer will be able to add another battle which merits inclusion in this list. That, in fact, the Battle of Britain will in the centuries to come be recognized as the last peculiarly British battle, in which the numbers were limited, the stakes so all-important, the victory so complete. To say this is in no way to denigrate the courage of Britishers in other battles, be they Salerno, Arnhem, Caen, or Burma, be they on land, on sea, or in the air, nor to underrate the vital importance of each struggle. But the Battle of Britain, like Agincourt, like Trafalgar, and like Waterloo, somehow stands apart, alone, in itself complete. It came at a time when a country reeling from successive defeats was in desperate need of a sign that not everything had to end in failure. It was tremendous theatre. It should not and will not ever be forgotten. And just as in Shakespeare's words, gentlemen in England, now abed, shall hold their manhoods cheap whiles any speaks that fought upon St. Crispin's day, so we who were Hurricane or Spitfire pilots, but took no part in that so glorious a battle, will for all our days nurse a quiet envy that we cannot say we were of the few, the very few, the band of brothers, which took on the Luftwaffe in full force over the skies of England, and threw it back with a bloody nose, never, by such daylight assaults, to try our strength at home again. But when all of this is said, when all due and utterly deserved credit is given to those who flew the Hurricanes and Spitfires, which won the Battle of Britain, and removed the danger of invasion from our shores, it should also be remembered that there were other Hurricane and Spitfire pilots, many, many times their number, who, scattered across the world over Britain, Europe, the Mediterranean, the Middle and Far East, and Burma, New exploits equally stirring, which perhaps because they were overshadowed by those momentous events of the summer of 1940, are to some degree overlooked. For it is in the nature of things that some particular occurrence, perhaps because of its vital homeland significance, or perhaps because by chance it is presented in a form which captures the public imagination, comes to be representative of a whole so that the other parts are overlooked. Such, for example, is the story of the bridge over the River Kwai, the spearhead in the mind, one might say, of the Burma-Siam Railway. Again, magnificent theatre, which seems to many of the general public to epitomize the lot of the Japanese prisoner of war, overshadowing equal or even worse horrors, equal or even greater suffering, equal or even more numerous casualties, which occurred elsewhere, as on the march to death through Borneo, on the railway in Sumatra, on the unbelievably awful prison ships, on tiny, unheard-of islets in the Banda Sea. In a small way, this book sets out to counterbalance this kind of overemphasis, and will, for example, contain no accounts of Battle of Britain combats. There may be those who will object that a book titled Hurricane and Spitfire Pilots at War, which sidesteps the Battle of Britain, is rather like Hamlet without the Prince of Denmark. But there is a difference. Without the Prince of Denmark there could not have been a Hamlet, whereas, if there had been no Battle of Britain, Hurricane and Spitfire pilots would certainly have been at war. Had I taken part in the Battle of Britain, no doubt I could scarcely have resisted including a major chapter or two about it. So in the pages which lie ahead, I have used my own wartime flying experiences as a thread on which to string the experiences of many others. I hope by this means to have achieved a more or less continuous narrative rather than ending up, as otherwise I might, with no more than a series of disconnected vignettes, recounting random exploits of a few of the many thousand who were privileged to fly these two magnificent aircraft. But I have left more or less untouched a battle already told many times, and many times well told, by those who fought it. Returning to the example of the bridge over the River Kwai, there's one other thing I wish to do in this account, and that is to endeavor to correct the false impression, which I suspect is held by the majority of the general public, that it was the Spitfire which played the more important role, not merely in the war in general, but in the Battle of Britain in particular. Recently, my wife and I were staying with friends in Tucson, Arizona, and were taken to lunch in its massive airbase, and it so happened that in the cloakroom my host and I found ourselves alone with one of the trainee pilots. "Have you ever heard of a hurricane?" my friend asked, and without hesitation the young man replied, "Why, yes, that's the aircraft that won the Battle of Britain, while the Spitfire got all the credit." It was a fascinating remark to hear from the lips of a 20-year-old American so many thousands of miles away in distance and nearly 50 years away in time. And there was a great deal of truth in it. 67 RAF squadrons were involved in the Battle of Britain, and of these 19 were Spitfire squadrons and 35 were Hurricane squadrons, the balance being made up of Blenheims, Beaufighters, Gladiators, and Defiants. Moreover, as Chas Bowyer, who never writes anything without properly researching it, points out, more than 1,700 Hurricanes were flown in the Battle of Britain, which was more than all other fighters added together, and nearly 80% of the victories claimed were claimed by Hurricane pilots. So far as casualties are concerned, 471 pilots were killed, and of these 242 were killed when flying Hurricanes and 149 while flying Spitfires. One could go on reeling off figures, for there are plenty from which to draw, but it would be to small avail. As already said, the Battle of Britain was to the British public tremendous theatre, and for all a rather lesser part it was the dainty Spitfire, beautiful as a butterfly, which stole the show. But if it was, as the young American from Tucson maintained, and many others have confirmed, the hurricane that was largely responsible for victory over the Luftwaffe through the long summer days of 1940. The Spitfire played an essential role, and together Hurricane and Spitfire formed a combination greater than its parts. Insofar as their separate roles could be defined, the Hurricanes was to attack the bombers, the Spitfires to give high cover and deal with the swarms of supporting Me-109s and 110s. But to say this is to oversimplify. Spitfires attacked the bombers whenever the opportunity was presented, and the Hurricane, in spite of its lower speed, was in many respects, through its maneuverability and its ability to accept punishment, at least as capable of dealing with the Luftwaffe fighters, and did so. As to which was the better aircraft of the two, well, the debate will of course continue until such time, if it ever comes, when interest in the Hurricane and Spitfire dies away. But the remark of the young Tucson pilot prompted me to seek the views of a couple of outstanding fighter pilots who had flown both machines operationally, of whom one should be British and the other American. The first of these was one of our best-known Battle of Britain pilots, Wing Commander Bob Stanford Tuck, the second Major James A. Goodson, who, with 32 victories credited to him, ranks second only to Major John T. Godfrey in the list of aces in the 4th American Fighter Group. "Well," said Stanford Tuck, "naturally my immediate love was for the Spitfire, because I had more experience on it, and it was so beautifully agile, alert, responsive to control, and faster. But the old Hurricane, once you got used to it, first time I sat in it I thought I'm going to break my neck if I fall off the seat. Dirty great cockpit, as you know, in comparison with the Spitfire. But then I did my first flight in it, and I thought it a wonderful old warhorse eventually, but hardly to be compared with the Spitfire. But I got used to it. Of course it was very good for attacking the bombers, instead of the Spitfire flat nose that went right out. The Hurricanes dropped away, so you had much better visibility. And one other also very important point in its favor, I thought, was the two banks of guns, one either side of you, 4 in each, which gave you a remarkably good concentration of fire at, say, 200 yards or whatever you wanted. That was a great advantage. And of course the amount of punishment it could take was incredible. It would come down with great lumps missing from it, and it was more maneuverable at low altitudes, although awful if you tried to drag it up high when it wallowed around, and if you tried to do too tight a turn high up, it'd just drop out of it. Whereas the Spits were fine even at 33,000, no bother. Bit damn cold up there, though. Goodson's views were really pretty close to those of Stanford Tuck's. The Hurricane was a much better gun platform. Of course, you know the difference in performance, but when it came to shooting from a Hurricane, number one, if you were in a turn, that enormous nose of a Spitfire didn't bank you out. Because to get enough deflection in a very tight turn with a Spit, the nose would blank out the target, and the Hurricane was so stable. The Spitfire, you moved the stick a fraction of an inch and you were doing this, and the gesture was expressive. The first few attacks I made, although I was right on top of the target, the Spitfire was jumping around such a lot, and if you got in the other fellow's slipstream, you had a terrible time. And I missed 3 or 4 victories which should have been a cinch, simply because the Spitfire was bouncing around. You had to get used to that. I've discussed this with Johnny Johnson, Air Vice Marshal J.E. Johnson, and he agreed. He said it takes time to get used to the Spitfire. You really had to hold it solid, but then, of course, when you got used to it, it was all right. Everybody loved the Spit when they got used to it. The Hurricane was an old workhorse, if you like, and I loved it, and it was a good gun platform, and at the right altitude it was more maneuverable. Of course, the Luftwaffe, when you talk to the Luftwaffe boys, they had more respect for the Spitfire than they had for the Hurricane, because the Spitfire could catch them. But they never mixed with either of them in a dogfight. In a dogfight, the Hurricane was every bit as good as the Spitfire. It was a great plane. I loved the Hurricane. You know what George Bullman, Hawker's chief test pilot, said of the Hurricane first time he saw it? Well, it may not fly, but it certainly won't break. So there it is. The fighter pilots who flew both machines preferred the Spitfire, but saw quite clearly that in some respects the Hurricane was superior. And in my submission one can no more put forward a logical argument in favor of one as against the other than one can as to one branch of the services against the next, for just as the Navy, the Army, and the Air Force were essentially complementary, so were the Spitfire and the Hurricane. The one was poetically beautiful and had a superior flying performance. The other was purposeful, robust, and astonishingly versatile. Both could, and frequently did, engage in similar types of operations, be it aerial combat, reconnaissance, strafing, bombing, or tank busting. But the particular role allotted to one or the other at a particular time or in a particular place, especially in the early years of the war, often came about not from choice but through the exigencies of the circumstances. Here lay the greatest strength, their versatility, and operating together, as in the Battle of Britain, they formed a partnership never to be equaled by any other air force. It is an interesting thought that whereas many kinds of aircraft ranged the skies over the battlegrounds of World War II, to none could the term ubiquitous be applied more aptly than to the Hurricanes and Spitfires. Whereas, according to the field of conflict, the Allies could expect to see different types, over Europe and the United Kingdom, Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs, over Italy and Africa, Macchis and Reggianes, in the Far East, Zeros and Hayabusas. All enemy air forces were, as we will see, to be plagued from first to last by the attentions of these two magnificent aircraft and the men who flew them.